The security footage still exists. 12 seconds of it, 9:47 in the morning, shows a bride in a $40,000 gown kneeling down to close a pair of handcuffs around a maid's wrists, then looping the chain through the iron bars of a wedding gate like she was tying up a dog. What the footage doesn't show is who was already walking up the driveway at that exact moment, 11 hours earlier than anyone expected him. By noon, the wedding was cancelled. By evening, the bride's family was on the phone with lawyers. And by the next morning, the woman in handcuffs owned more of that estate than the bride ever would have. If this story moves you, stay until the end, and consider subscribing so more stories like this one find you. My name is Naomi Carter, and for 6 years, I worked in other people's houses. Not because I had to. Because I chose to disappear into a life nobody was watching, while I quietly rebuilt one that mattered. I want to tell you how I ended up in handcuffs at a gate I technically owned, and why the man everyone called a billionaire almost lost everything the moment he found out what his fiancée had done. I grew up in a small house outside Charleston, raised by my grandmother, Odessa, after my parents passed when I was 9. Odessa cleaned houses for a living, 6 days a week, and she raised me in whatever hours were left over. I remember her hands most of all. They were always chapped, always moving, always doing something for someone else. She never complained about the work itself. What she complained about, quietly, only to me, late at night when she thought I was asleep, was the way some of the families she worked for looked straight through her, like she was part of the furniture they'd hired to keep the real furniture clean. One of the houses she cleaned belonged to a man named Marcus Voss. Marcus wasn't rich yet. He was a contractor in his 30s with a half-built idea for a construction financing model and no money to get it off the ground. He worked out of a cramped office above a hardware store, and he paid my grandmother out of his own pocket to keep that office presentable for the investors he was always trying to impress. My grandmother liked him, she told me once, because he was the only man in that building who ever looked her in the eye and asked how her day was going, and actually waited for the answer. One winter, Marcus came to her, embarrassed, and told her he couldn't pay her for the month. The business was on the edge of folding. My grandmother didn't hesitate. She told him to keep the money and put it into whatever he needed to keep the lights on, because a debt owed to her wasn't worth as much as a chance not wasted. He never forgot that. Years later, when Marcus Voss became one of the wealthiest developers on the East Coast, he tracked my grandmother down at a small apartment she'd moved into after I left for college, and he tried to repay her with a check for more money than she'd made in a decade of work. She refused it. She told him money handed over out of guilt wasn't a gift, it was a transaction, and she didn't want a transaction. So instead, quietly, without telling anyone, without even telling me, Marcus set up a trust in her name, folded into a small percentage of shares in his private holding company, structured so it would grow untouched for years. Nobody in his family knew. Nobody in mine did either, until the day a lawyer sat across from me at a plain conference table, 6 weeks after my grandmother's funeral, and read paperwork I didn't understand yet. I was 26 when my grandmother passed, and grief does strange things to a person's plans. I had a business degree I wasn't using, because after graduation I'd taken care of her through 2 years of declining health instead of chasing a career, and now I had a trust fund I didn't understand, tied up in a company I'd never set foot in, run by a family who had no idea I existed. I didn't want to be handed anything. I especially didn't want to walk into a boardroom as the cleaning lady's granddaughter and have people wonder, for the rest of my life, whether I belonged there or had simply been given a seat out of guilt. I wanted to know, for myself, whether I could stand on my own before I ever let anyone else's money hold me up. So instead of cashing out the trust or calling the Voss family to introduce myself, I did something that probably sounds foolish to anyone who's never grieved a parent twice. I took a job. A real one, ordinary and invisible, working event coordination and household staffing for high-end properties around the city, the kind of work that puts you inside people's homes and inside their true character within the first hour, because nobody performs for the help. I told myself I'd reveal who I was eventually, once I understood the business the way my grandmother had understood the people in it, from the ground up, with my hands, not from a spreadsheet. I didn't know, when I took that first assignment, that it would eventually place me at a property still connected to the Voss family. I found that out the same week I found out Julian Voss was getting married. That decision put me, 18 months later, inside the gates of the Ashcombe estate, 3 days before the wedding of Julian Voss, Marcus's only son. Julian had built his own fortune separate from his father's, a logistics and renewable energy company that made him, by every financial magazine's estimate, a billionaire in his own right by 34. He was known for being blunt, private, and almost obsessively loyal to the people who worked for him. What he wasn't known for, at least not yet, was his fiancée. Her name was Vanessa Calloway, and the first time I saw her, she was standing in the middle of the estate's ballroom, pointing at a chandelier and telling the events manager it looked, in her words, cheap. The chandelier had come from a 19th-century French estate and cost more than most people's houses. I remember thinking, even then, that a woman who could look at something priceless and call it cheap probably didn't know the difference between value and price. I had no idea yet how much that instinct would matter. For the first 2 days, Vanessa barely looked at the staff. We were furniture to her, useful and silent, arranged and rearranged without a word of acknowledgement. I didn't take it personally at first. I'd worked enough of these events to know that some people only notice you when something goes wrong, and I'd made a kind of peace with being invisible, since invisibility had let me learn things about this world I never could have learned any other way. I watched how the events manager, a sharp, tired woman named Carol, handled every impossible request with a patience I admired. I watched the way Rosa and the other servers moved through a room without ever letting a tray tip or a glass empty for more than a minute. There was a whole invisible choreography to keeping an event like this together, and for 2 days I was simply grateful to be part of it. What I didn't expect was how quickly, and how specifically, Vanessa would decide to notice me. It started small. She asked my name once, then never used it again, calling me the tall one to the other staff even when I was standing close enough to hear. She corrected my folding of napkins in front of guests who hadn't arrived yet, just to be corrected in front of someone. When I brought her a tray of florals to approve, she knocked one arrangement to the floor and told me to redo all of them, though nothing had been wrong with the first. I began to notice that her corrections only ever landed on me. Not on Priya, who ran the kitchen staff. Not on Daniel, who managed the valet team. Only on me, the one black woman working closest to her, and I started keeping quiet mental notes, the way you do when a pattern is forming and you want to be sure before you say it out loud, even to yourself. The other staff noticed too. On the second night, Rosa pulled me aside near the kitchen and said quietly that Vanessa had asked Carol, point blank, why, if someone like her, was working close contact positions instead of being kept in the back with linens. Carol, to her credit, said nothing and simply moved the conversation along. But Rosa told me because she thought I should know what was being said about me in rooms I wasn't in, and I've never forgotten that small kindness. I thanked her, and I filed it away with everything else. I still hadn't told anyone who I really was. Part of me, honestly, wanted to see how far this would go before I had to use anything as a shield, because I wanted proof, real proof, not just a feeling I could talk myself out of later. That same night, I overheard something I wasn't meant to hear. I was carrying a stack of linens past a half-open sitting room door when I heard Vanessa's voice, low and irritated, on the phone with someone. She was talking about the wedding budget, about how her own family couldn't cover a fraction of this, about how relieved she was that Julian's money made all of it someone else's problem. She laughed, a brittle little laugh, and said something that stuck with me for days afterward. She said she'd worked too hard to end up back where she started, and she wasn't about to let anyone, staff included, remind her of it. At the time I thought it was just wedding stress talking. Later, it would explain almost everything. The next afternoon, a small thing happened that I almost let slide. Vanessa asked me to move a display of seating cards from one table to another, then, 20 minutes later, loudly informed Carol in front of several vendors that I'd clearly moved the wrong ones, and created confusion for the calligrapher. The cards were exactly where she told me to put them. I had the original instruction written on my own clipboard, in her handwriting, because she'd insisted on writing it herself so there'd be no mistakes. When I quietly showed Carol the note, Vanessa waved it off and said I must have written it myself to cover for the error. Carol didn't push back, not because she believed Vanessa, I could tell, but because pushing back on a bride 3 days before her wedding wasn't a fight worth having over seating cards. I understood that. But I noticed it. I was keeping a private list by then, in my head, of every small moment where the truth didn't matter as much as who was saying it. 2 days before the wedding, a small emerald bracelet went missing from the bridal suite. Vanessa's mother reported it to Carol in a panic, describing it as an heirloom worth close to $60,000, insisting it had been sitting on the vanity that morning and was simply gone by early afternoon. The estate was searched, quietly, room by room, staff members interviewed one at a time in a small office off the kitchen. I answered every question honestly. I hadn't been anywhere near the bridal suite that afternoon. I'd been coordinating outdoor seating with 2 other staff members who could confirm exactly where I was, down to the minute, because we'd been checking chairs against a printed diagram together the entire time. I remember sitting across from the estate's head of security during that interview, watching him write down my answers, and feeling something I hadn't expected. Not fear exactly. More like a held breath, the specific tension of knowing you've done nothing wrong and still not being entirely sure that will be enough. I'd felt that tension before, in other rooms, with other people, long before I ever set foot on this estate, and I hated that some small part of me still braced for it out of habit. The bracelet turned up 4 hours later, tangled in the lining of a garment bag that had been moved twice that day by 2 different staff members, neither of whom had any reason to have taken it and put it back. Nobody had stolen anything. It had simply fallen, the way small clasps on old jewelry sometimes do, and gotten caught somewhere no one thought to check until someone finally did. Vanessa never apologized. Not to me, not to Carol, not to the 2 staff members who'd been questioned alongside me. She simply moved on to the next item on her list, as if the entire afternoon had cost her nothing. But something in how she looked at me after that shifted, like the absence of proof hadn't changed her mind at all, only her patience. I caught her watching me twice that evening, across the ballroom, with an expression I couldn't fully name at the time. I understand it now. It was the look of someone deciding that the truth was inconvenient, and that she intended to get her way regardless of what it was. The night before the wedding, I almost quit. I sat in my car in the estate's staff parking area after my shift ended, keys in the ignition, seriously considering calling Carol in the morning and telling her I couldn't come back. Not out of fear exactly, more out of exhaustion, the specific kind that comes from being watched and doubted for days on end by someone who held more social power than you, even when you both knew, quietly, that you held more of something else. I thought about calling Julian directly, introducing myself over the phone instead of in person, letting the truth defuse the situation before it could escalate any further. I decided against it. Some stubborn part of me wanted to see this through the way I'd started it, on my own 2 feet, under my own name, without using anything as a shield until I absolutely had to. I drove home that night telling myself it was almost over, one more day, and then this particular chapter would close for good. I had no idea, driving home in the dark, just how wrong that particular guess would turn out to be, or how right it would turn out to be in a completely different way than I expected. The morning of the wedding, I arrived before 6. Estate staff always do, because the hours before a ceremony are when everything either comes together or falls apart, and someone has to be there to catch it. I was assigned to the front gate and entrance coordination, checking early vendor arrivals against a list, making sure florists and photographers were cleared in through security before the property opened to guests at 10. It was quiet work, methodical, the kind of morning task nobody thinks about until it goes wrong. At around 9:30, Vanessa came storming across the lawn in her robe, her hair half done, screaming that another piece of jewelry was missing, this time a pair of diamond earrings that had belonged to her grandmother. 2 of the bridesmaids trailed behind her, one of them holding a tablet, both looking more embarrassed than alarmed, which told me something about how often this kind of outburst had happened before I'd ever met her. She was hysterical in a way that felt performed even through the panic, her voice pitched to carry across the lawn to the small crowd of vendors already setting up, and before Carol could even begin the usual protocol, calm interviews, a room-by-room check. The same process that had found the bracelet safely 2 days earlier, Vanessa turned, looked directly at me, and said the words I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "It's her. It's always been her. I want her detained until the police get here." I felt every eye on that lawn shift toward me at once. A florist froze mid-step with an armful of white peonies. A photographer lowered his camera slowly, unsure if he was about to be documenting something he shouldn't. I remember thinking, in the strange, detached way your mind works when something terrible is happening to you in real time, that I could see this exact moment playing out 2 different ways, And that the difference between them would depend entirely on whether anyone in that crowd was willing to say a single word on my behalf. No one did. Not yet. I told her, calmly, that I hadn't left the front gate in over 3 hours, that I could prove it, that the property had cameras on every entrance, that Daniel from the valet team had been standing beside me for most of that time and could confirm it right then, on the spot. She wasn't listening. Her mother tried, weakly, to suggest they simply check the footage first, and Vanessa turned on her too, snapping that there wasn't time, that the ceremony was in hours, that someone needed to be held accountable right now. She grabbed a set of decorative handcuffs from a prop box meant for a photo booth station near the gate, the kind meant to be a joke for the reception later, plastic-lined but real enough to lock, and before security could even react, before I fully understood what was happening, she'd closed them around my wrists and looped the short chain through the wrought iron bars of the estate's front gate. She did it herself, kneeling in her robe on the gravel, her hands shaking with an anger that had nothing to do with any missing earrings. She was crying and shouting at the same time, telling the small cluster of early guests and vendors who'd started to gather that she'd caught her thief, that she wasn't going to let someone like this ruin her wedding day. I remember the specific way she said those words, someone like this, and I remember understanding, with total clarity, exactly what she meant by them, even though she never said it plainly enough for anyone to write down. I stood there at that gate, wrists bound to iron, in front of florists and photographers and a catering crew who all just stared, frozen, none of them sure whether to intervene against the bride on her own wedding day. The gravel dug into my shoes. The morning sun was already warm, and I remember the strange, small detail of a bee circling one of the peony arrangements a few feet away, going about its business as if nothing at all was wrong, while my wrists ached against cold metal and a woman I barely knew sobbed accusations at me that weren't true. I want to be honest with you. In that moment, I wasn't thinking about the trust fund, or the shares, or who my grandmother had been to this family. I was thinking about every time in my life someone had decided what I was capable of before they'd bothered to ask. I was thinking about my grandmother's hands, cracked from years of other people's floors, and how she never once raised her voice at anyone who didn't deserve it, no matter how she was treated. I was thinking, too, about how easy it would have been in that moment to scream my name, my history, my stake in this very property, and watch every face around me change instantly out of fear rather than decency. I chose not to. I stayed quiet. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I just waited, because I had learned a long time ago that dignity is sometimes the only thing you get to choose in a moment like that, and I chose it, even as the minutes stretched past 10, then 15, with no one moving to help me. Vanessa's mother was already on the phone with the estate's private security firm, demanding the police be called, when a car came up the long gravel driveway 11 hours before anyone expected it. Julian Voss wasn't supposed to arrive until the evening before the ceremony was originally planned, but a cancelled overseas meeting had put him on an earlier flight, and he'd decided, on a whim, to surprise Vanessa by showing up at the estate that morning instead. He told me later that the last thing he expected to see, driving up to his own wedding, was his fiancée standing over a member of the household staff who was handcuffed to the front gate, sobbing accusations at a woman who hadn't moved, hadn't fought back, and hadn't said a single word in her own defense. He got out of the car before it had fully stopped, leaving the driver's door open behind him, and for a second the entire lawn went silent in a different way than it had before. Vanessa's face shifted the instant she saw him, the tears drying up almost immediately, replaced by something closer to relief, as if she believed his arrival meant vindication rather than the opposite. I remember the exact moment Julian recognized my face, because his expression didn't change the way I expected. It wasn't shock at the handcuffs first. It was something quieter, something almost like recognition, though we'd never formally met. I found out later that his father, Marcus, kept a single-framed photograph in his office of my grandmother standing outside that old hardware store office decades ago, and Julian had grown up hearing her name spoken with more reverence than almost anyone else in his father's history. He didn't know my face from that photograph. But some part of him, I think, knew the shape of what he was looking at before his mind caught up to the details. He walked straight past Vanessa without a word and crouched down in front of me on the gravel, careless of his own clothes. He asked if I was hurt. His voice was quiet, controlled, but I could see the effort it was taking him to keep it that way. Then he stood, turned to the head of security, and asked, in a voice I hadn't heard him use before, low and absolutely level, why no one on his own property had removed the handcuffs the second they were put on a member of his staff. Vanessa tried to explain. She said jewelry was missing, that I'd been caught, that she was protecting their wedding day. Julian asked her one question. He asked if she had any actual evidence, anything at all, beyond the fact that I was the one working closest to her. Vanessa didn't answer. She just kept repeating that she had a feeling that staff like me were always the ones, and I watched something in Julian's face close like a door. He personally unlocked the handcuffs with a key security kept on site for the prop box, and as he helped me up, I saw his eyes go to my wrists, red from the metal, and then back to Vanessa with a look I can only describe as the moment a person realizes they've been engaged to someone they never actually knew. What happened next unraveled faster than anyone at that estate could have predicted. Julian asked me, in front of everyone, if I was willing to press charges. I told him I wasn't interested in punishing anyone out of anger. I only wanted the truth on the record, and I wanted it heard by every person standing on that lawn who had watched and said nothing. That was when I finally told him who I was. I explained, as calmly as I could manage with my hands still shaking and red marks still visible on my wrists, that my grandmother had once been the woman who cleaned his father's house, back when his father had nothing but an idea and an office above a hardware store. I explained the trust, the shares, the paperwork I'd read only once, 6 weeks after her funeral, and never touched since. I told him I'd taken this job under my own name, doing ordinary work, sweeping floors and folding napkins and checking guest lists at gates just like this one, because I wanted to understand my own worth before I let anyone hand it to me, before I ever let a title decide how people were required to treat me. Julian went pale. Not because he was angry at me, but because he realized his father had told him, years ago, sitting in that same office with the framed photograph on the wall, about a woman named Odessa who'd once saved the company before it fully existed, refusing payment when it mattered most, asking for nothing in return. He'd heard that story a dozen times growing up. He had never once connected it to the woman who'd been handcuffed to his gate an hour before his own wedding, and I watched the exact moment the two truths collided behind his eyes, the guilt of it landing on him like a physical weight. "You could have told me who you were the first day you walked onto this property," he said quietly, not as an accusation, more like he was trying to understand. "I know," I told him. "But then I never would have known what I just found out." Vanessa, standing off to the side, seemed to shrink as she understood what this meant. It wasn't just that she'd humiliated a staff member. She'd handcuffed a woman who held a documented, legal stake in the very company whose name was on the wedding invitations, a woman whose family history was tied to Julian's more deeply, in some ways, than Vanessa's own would ever be. I watched her mind visibly working through the calculation, searching for a version of an apology that could still salvage the day, and I understood, watching her, that even now, even in this moment, she wasn't sorry for what she'd done. She was only sorry about who I'd turned out to be. But that fact, as significant as it was, wasn't actually what ended things. What ended things was simpler than that. Julian looked at the woman he was supposed to marry in 4 hours and asked her a single question in front of everyone gathered at that gate, his voice carrying easily across the now silent lawn. "Would you have done this," he asked her, "if she'd had nothing? If there was no trust, no shares, no name that meant anything to anyone? Would you have chained her to this gate and called her a thief with no proof at all?" Vanessa opened her mouth twice before anything came out, and when it did, it wasn't an apology. It was an excuse, something about stress and missing jewelry and how anyone would have made the same assumption under that kind of pressure. Julian didn't let her finish. He asked the question again, more slowly, and this time Vanessa didn't answer. She didn't have to. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said, and everyone standing on that lawn heard it exactly the same way. The wedding was called off within the hour. Julian personally informed the 200 guests who'd begun arriving that the ceremony would not be taking place, offering no details beyond a private family matter, protecting me from becoming a headline before I'd even had a chance to process what had happened to me. Vendors were paid in full for their trouble. Staff were sent home with an apology and full pay for the week. And Vanessa, humiliated in front of a crowd that had come to celebrate her, left the estate that afternoon with her mother, refusing to speak to anyone, including the man she'd nearly married. In the weeks that followed, the story got out anyway, the way stories like this always do. A guest had filmed part of it on their phone before Julian arrived, 12 seconds that ended up circulating further than any of us wanted, first among people who'd been at the estate that morning, then further, through screenshots and reposts, until it stopped being our private disaster and became something strangers had opinions about. I hated that part more than almost anything else. My worst morning had become a clip other people watched during their lunch breaks, forming judgments about a life they knew nothing about. Vanessa's family tried, briefly, to frame it as a misunderstanding, insisting jewelry really had gone missing and that emotions had simply run high on a stressful morning, the kind of statement designed to sound like an apology without actually admitting anything. But the missing earrings turned up 3 days later exactly where the emeralds had, tangled in fabric that had been moved and searched more than once by the same anxious hands. There had never been a theft. There had only ever been an assumption, and a woman who acted on it without a second of hesitation, twice, in the span of 3 days, against the same person both times. What came out later, slowly, through people who'd known Vanessa longer than I had, filled in a piece of the picture I hadn't understood at the gate. She wasn't from the kind of money her wardrobe suggested. Her family had spent years living just beyond their means, and marrying Julian wasn't only a romance to her, it was an exit from a version of her life she'd spent a decade trying to outrun. The overheard phone call I'd caught 2 nights before the wedding made a different kind of sense once I understood that. She'd worked too hard, in her own mind, to climb out of a life that looked uncomfortably similar to the ones the household staff around her still lived, and some ugly, unexamined part of her needed someone beneath her to make the distance feel real. I don't say that to excuse what she did to me. Nothing excuses it. But it helped me understand that cruelty like hers rarely comes from nowhere. It comes from fear, dressed up as superiority, aimed at whoever is standing closest and least likely to be believed. Julian didn't need the video or the recovered jewelry to know what he'd seen with his own eyes. But the fact that the evidence lined up so completely against her only made it harder for anyone in Vanessa's circle to keep defending her. 2 of her closest friends, who'd been in the wedding party, publicly distanced themselves within days, one of them posting a quiet statement saying she'd never felt comfortable with how Vanessa treated service staff and regretted not saying so sooner. Her own mother, in an attempt at damage control, gave an interview to a local outlet trying to soften what had happened, and only made it worse by referring to me as hired help instead of using my name even after being told what it was, a phrase that told viewers everything they needed to know about where that family's instincts actually lived, no matter how carefully they tried to phrase the rest of the interview. Carol called me a few days after the story broke, apologizing for not stepping in sooner at the gate, telling me she'd replayed that morning in her mind more times than she could count, wishing she'd found the nerve to argue harder in those first 30 seconds. I told her what I meant. I wasn't angry at the staff who'd stood there frozen. I understood, better than almost anyone, the particular fear of losing a job over standing up to a client's family, the quiet arithmetic people run in their heads when a paycheck is on one side of a decision and a stranger's dignity is on the other. I'd run that same arithmetic myself for most of my adult life. What I wanted, more than apologies from people who'd been afraid, was a policy that meant no one would ever have to make that choice again on any property connected to that company. As for me, I spent the first few days after the wedding mostly in silence, sitting with what had happened rather than rushing to explain it to anyone. I turned my phone off for most of it. I wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or a headline, and I definitely wasn't interested in the string of messages from people who'd never once checked on me before but suddenly wanted to know if I was okay, now that my name was attached to a company worth billions. I was interested in something quieter and harder to answer. I was interested in understanding why, even with paperwork proving my stake in that company, my first instinct at that gate had still been to stay quiet and absorb it, the way I'd been taught to do my whole life, the way my grandmother had absorbed things for decades before I was even born. I sat with that question for a long time. I thought about every job I'd ever had where I'd swallowed something unfair because speaking up felt more dangerous than staying silent. I thought about my grandmother and whether her silence had ever actually been peace, or whether it had simply been the only tool she had access to in a world that rarely gave women like her any other option. I decided, sitting in my small apartment with my wrists still faintly marked, tracing the fading red lines with my own fingers, that I was done absorbing things quietly. Not with anger, though I had every right to it. With clarity. I wanted my calm to come from choice now, not from fear. Julian reached out a week later, not as an apology on behalf of anyone else, but as himself. He asked if I would be willing to meet with the company's board, formally, to discuss the trust his father had set up and the role, if any, I wanted to take within it. I told him I wasn't interested in a seat I hadn't earned, and I could hear him thinking through that sentence on the other end of the line before he answered. He said the seat had already been earned, decades ago, by a woman who'd believed in his father before anyone gave her a reason to, and that the only thing left to decide was whether I wanted to step into what she'd built for me without ever asking for anything in return. He said his father, Marcus, had actually cried when he heard what happened at the gate, not out of sympathy alone, but out of a specific, personal shame, knowing that the woman who'd been humiliated on his son's property carried the same blood as the person who'd once saved his entire company with a single quiet decision. I told Julian I needed time, and he respected that without pushing, which told me more about who he actually was than anything Vanessa had shown me about herself in 3 days. He didn't call again for 2 weeks. When he finally did, it was to ask if I'd be willing to have dinner with his father, not to discuss the company, just to talk, and I said yes, because I realized I wanted to know the man my grandmother had believed in before he became who he was. That dinner with Marcus Voss lasted almost 4 hours. He told me stories about my grandmother I'd never heard, small ones, the kind that don't make it into anyone's official history. He told me she used to leave him a cup of coffee on his desk every morning without a word, back when he couldn't afford to hire anyone else, and how she'd once talked him out of taking a predatory loan that would have sunk the business in its first year, simply by asking him one plain question about what he'd do if the loan came due before the money did. He said he owed more of his empire to that one woman's instincts than to any investor who'd ever backed him, and he'd spent decades quietly wishing he'd found a way to properly thank her while she was still alive to hear it. Sitting across from him, hearing my grandmother described not as staff, but as someone whose judgment had shaped the foundation of everything that came after, I understood, for the first time, the full weight of what she'd left behind for me. Over the following months, I did step into the role, slowly, on my own terms, refusing every offer to fast-track me into a title I hadn't grown into. I joined the company not as a figurehead but as someone learning the business from the inside, sitting in on financial reviews, walking construction sites in work boots, asking questions until I actually understood the answers, the same way my grandmother had once learned this world by watching a man build something out of nothing from a folding chair in the corner of his office. I kept my old friendships from the household staff world close. Rosa, who'd been the first to warn me quietly about what was being said behind my back, is one of my closest friends to this day, and when I was finally given real authority within the company, one of the first things I did was create a scholarship fund for staff members and their children who wanted to pursue education beyond the work they currently did, because I never wanted anyone under that company's roof to feel as trapped in invisibility as I once had, by choice or otherwise. I also made sure the estate's policies changed permanently, so that no employee, ever again, could be detained, restrained, or accused without immediate intervention, documented evidence, and a review process that didn't depend on the whims of whoever happened to be loudest in the room. It wasn't revenge. It was simply making sure the gate I'd once been chained to could never be used that way against anyone else, regardless of who they were, or who they weren't yet known to be. Vanessa, from what I later heard, left the city entirely, moving somewhere quieter, away from the friends and circles who'd once treated her as the center of every room. The scandal followed her further than she expected, not because of any campaign against her, but because people had seen the footage with their own eyes and reached their own conclusions long before anyone needed to explain it to them. I never once felt satisfaction hearing about her struggles, even when the temptation was there. I understood, better than most, what it costs a person to lose everything they built their identity around, watching it collapse in full view of everyone who once admired them. I simply accepted that the identity she'd built had never included room for people like me, not really, not honestly, and that was never something I could fix for her, no matter how much power I now technically held over the very company whose name had been on her wedding invitations. Julian and I stayed in each other's lives, first professionally, then, over time, as something closer to friends who deeply respected one another, though I want to be honest with you that this story was never really about romance. It was about the 12 seconds of video captured and the 6 years before that, when I chose, over and over, to build myself quietly instead of demanding to be seen. When people ask me now what I remember most from that morning, they expect me to say the humiliation, the cold metal, the crowd that didn't move to help me. What I actually remember most is the silence right after Julian asked Vanessa his question, the moment the truth finally outweighed the performance, and how it felt to stand up on my own, wrists free, and realize that nobody in that crowd could ever again mistake my quiet for weakness. I think about my grandmother a lot, about the check she refused decades ago and the small, patient trust that grew in the background of a life she never got to see fully unfold, waiting quietly for someone to need it more than the money mattered. I think about how she used to say that some people will only ever value you for what you can do for them, and that the moment you stop needing their permission is the moment you finally become free. I didn't understand that lesson the way I do now, not really, not the way you understand something once it's cost you something to learn it. I understand it every time I walk past that front gate, restored now, its iron bars unchanged, but its meaning completely different to me than it was on the worst morning of my life. I've thought about having it removed entirely more than once. In the end, I decided to keep it exactly as it was, because I never want to forget what it felt like standing there, and I never want anyone working under that company's name to forget why the policies changed. I lost a wedding I was never invited to in the first place, and a version of respect that was never real to begin with. But I found something my grandmother spent her whole life quietly building toward, without ever once demanding credit for it. I found out exactly who I was, on my own terms, standing at a gate that could no longer hold me.